Alright, so I usually try not to talk too much about current events because we don't have all the information, we don't know what's going on. But one thing I'm good at talking about, I think, is bad writing and bad reporting. And I caught an NBC News segment. I'm only going to play a small clip of it here.
First terror attack in the country's history. Yahya
This is obviously about the recent terror attacks in Israel and the follow up campaign in Gaza. So I'm going to go back a little bit so that we can. Because I think I prefer starting. I prefer not cutting off.
Yahya Sinwar is the leader of Hamas in Gaza, and Israel says the mastermind of Saturday's carefully orchestrated slaughter.
So up to this point, and even actually
he
we'll
chose to send the butchers into our bedrooms to kill our babies. And when they chose to go full front against Israel, they signed their own death warrants.
Allahu Akbar! Sinwar knows better than most.
So up until this point, up until Sinwar knows better than most, we're okay. The reporting is pretty good, pretty reasonable. We've got a actually fairly even-handed, like, hey, this is how what happened. Here's where NBC News goes off the rails.
Knows better than most the value of hostages as human bargaining chips.
All right, he knows better than most the value of hostages as bargaining chips. Okay, he's a terrorist leader. That's within his wheelhouse, his skill set.
The son of Palestinian refugees, he was supposed to spend the rest of his life in an Israeli jail after.
There, as the son of refugees, he was supposed to spend the rest of his life in an Israeli jail.
Being convicted of terrorism.
Being convicted of terrorism. Well, that's really a weird way to phrase it, right? Because at first it sounds like, oh, he was a refugee and Israel just threw him into jail for no reason. Oh, he was convicted of terrorism. Well, okay. Maybe you don't trust the Israeli government. So what was he found guilty of? Well, right here. First arrested for subversive activities in the 80s. Again, in 85, he was released and co-founded a security organization. You know, so became the police of Hamas. Okay, this is all, pretty basic stuff. So, in 1988, he masterminded the abduction and killing of 2 Israeli soldiers and the murder of 4 Palestinians he suspected of cooperating with Israel, for which he was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to 4 life sentences. So, yeah, convicted of terrorism. But here's a guy who literally was part of a secret police force, who literally murdered Palestinians as well as Israelis, and he was thrown in jail for being convicted in a court of law for these crimes. He was released in a prisoner exchange, and Israel basically traded him for the IDF soldier. I think it was like early 2011. There we go. We've got the date in here. I don't need to try and remember things. They gave him a second chance. Well, actually, it looks like a third or fourth or fifth chance, where they were like, okay, you killed 6 people, and you have been part of a reign of terror in ferreting out people you call spies. Maybe some of them were, maybe some of them weren't. But when you have a reign of terror, eventually Robespierre sees spies everywhere, and eventually people see Robespierre as a spy. I'm pronouncing his name wrong. Don't care. Moving on. This is the guy that they just said knows what it's like to be a hostage because he was held hostage. No, he was not held hostage. He was convicted of crimes and sent to jail. Darrell Brooks isn't held hostage. Anyone you can think of who's in jail? The cop who was found guilty of murdering George Floyd? Not a hostage. He's a prisoner of a legal justice system. The guy who did his 19th DUI in your neighborhood? Not a hostage. A prisoner or a convict. You can come up with a lot of terms, but hostage is the wrong phrase for NBC to have used for Sinwar. And that's fine. Maybe it was just a slip. Here's where the problem comes.
But in 2011, he was freed in a prisoner swap, Israel releasing him and 1,000 other Palestinians to secure the freedom of Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier held captive by Hamas in Gaza for 5 years. Today, Sinwar controls the fate of the hostages.
They use the same term. The same term that they used for Sinwar, who murdered people and who was a known terrorist sympathizer since the 80s, thrown in jail for the 4th time for disrupting not just the Israeli side of the peace process, but the Palestinian side, actively undermined efforts to reach some sort of accord between these two groups, because he's part of the third group, Hamas, who doesn't care about either of the other two groups. As part of Hamas, he murdered both Palestinians and Israelis. And Israel finally captured him, put him on trial, convicted him, and sent him to jail. He was a hostage. No, he was not. He was a prisoner. Maybe you'd call him a prisoner of war, except he's a terrorist and not really part of a formal army, so prisoner of war isn't... I guess we've called other terrorists who were captured as POWs, but this looks like he wasn't captured in the... Like, it looks like he was captured as part of a government, not military operation, like a civil government operation. I don't know, it doesn't really go into a lot of details here, but the point is, he was not a hostage. And if NBC had just called him a hostage, I would have been like, oh, that's a little sloppy, you do better. But then, they're using the same term for this guy who was in jail for murder, who carried out the terror campaign of October 2023, just last week or so, mattering when you're viewing this video and when I post this video compared to when I record it. That guy they refer to as a hostage, they're going to use the same terms for the people who are kidnapped straight out of that peace concert, straight out of the various settlements along the border there. The women who have been reported as raped and kidnapped, the missing children that you could see in that Hamas video of the fighters parading around the kidnapped children, those are hostages. Those are people we use the term hostage for, not for people legally convicted of murder. Now, the rest of the NBC report...
carry detailed diagrams highlighting the weak points of his new documents tonight obtained by NBC.
Go, you will do no harm. Show some decency. Holding your family, what would you tell them? Show some decency. Show some respect.
Sinwar knows...
They signed their own death warrants.
Sinwar...
Where they're talking about how Sinwar was a hostage and he was convicted of terrorism. No, he was a murderer who has been given multiple chances by the Israeli government to stop murdering civilians, and he has refused to use the same term for where do we have a picture of him giving one of his speeches. I think it's after this blur.
Yahya Sinwar.
To compare this guy being a hostage to the woman in that viral video that they show shortly after the interview with the IDF officer is such a tortured twist of language that NBC should be embarrassed, and they should probably find whoever approved this story, whoever wrote this, it's not really a story, this hit piece, this like hit as in like it's a news hit, you get them, it's a term I've heard a couple of times, I don't like it, news piece that you think written, but this news segment, there's a good term for it. They should really get that person a thesaurus, a dictionary, and maybe this Wikipedia article so that they can learn the guy who was held hostage is a murderer. The people who he is holding hostage are civilians who committed no crime. Or at least, maybe they did commit a crime. Who knows? They weren't convicted of a crime. No lawful authority has given them any form of due process. And most importantly, as far as we're aware, random lady at the concert didn't kill people and hasn't been part of an active terror campaign since the 80s to undermine peace between Palestine and Israel. NBC News screwed up. This is a terrible segment. From about this 40-second mark to when they're finished talking about it.
refugees, he was supposed to spend the rest of his life in an Israeli ship.
Kill our babies.
Sinwar knows better than most the value of hostages as human bargaining chips.
Compare those videos of hostages to being convicted. This was... I'm gonna just repeat myself over and over. 10 minutes, good segment from me, I think. But NBC, how could you mess this up so bad? Anyway, I try not to, like I said at the start, we'll bookend this. I don't like to try to get into current events, but I'm not trying to talk about the current event itself, even though obviously, if you listen to 10 minutes of this, the current event matters. But this is more a criticism of how bad NBC News did this. And I guess after this video we'll go back to lighter things, and maybe we'll do some more book reports and things like that. But this was so bad, NBC News needs to be on notice that this is bad reporting.